Breathing in and letting go. Once again, coming into this moment. And here we are. Thank you for everyone who is present, and thank you for anyone watching at home later on. So today's topic, as previously mentioned, is mastery of emotion. And we're going to be tying in a little bit of meditation as well, meditation training today as well. But to start with, something I like to teach students and clients, and this is on the inside of your packet here at the very top on the right side, is how I like to define emotions. They are temporary manifestations of vital information that have an inherent neutral nature. A lot of interesting words there. I'll read that again. Temporary manifestations of vital information that have an inherent neutral nature. So a lot of times when we experience emotions, we tend to add morality to them or duality to them. Some are good, some are bad, some are right, some are wrong, some are appropriate, some are inappropriate, depending on the circumstance, depending on the time. And then oftentimes we'll also have expectations on other people and how they're not being emotional enough in certain situations. And so it's so interesting that emotions are something that tie all of humanity together, but they often become a great source of judgment for ourselves and other people. And a lot of times we'll try to suppress them within ourselves, or we'll try to chase after the positive ones while pushing away the negative ones. Again, that positive and negative. But if you really tap into Zen, tap into living peace, tap into the Junisha studies, we really start to recognize that all emotions inherently are neutral. And they're all just nuggets of information for us to help us understand the nature of reality and to understand ourselves better. And so when we take a neutral stance towards emotions, they stop being something scary. Pain and grief are no longer something to fear. Guilt and shame are something to beautifully explore. And all of these things, fear and anxiety, they're all just beautiful nuggets of information that can actually help lead us to enlightenment or lead us to inner peace. And so one of the first things that we learn here as students in the Junisha program is to cease resisting certain emotions. Who's ever resisted an emotion before? Right? And doesn't it either leads to a perpetual numbness or it leads to a perpetual resistance and even a tension. If you've ever resisted emotions before, you can actually feel the tension in your body to where you're pushing it away. And anyone who's ever struggled with addiction, generally there is some form of resisting certain emotions that are arising, resisting processing very difficult situations in one's life. And then you develop a dependency that allows you to continually distract yourself from it. Not always, but in a lot of cases, that is the case. And so I just wanted to start with just kind of throwing that little definition, our definition of emotions out there, following it up with a quote from my book, Living Peace, which is, just because I think a thought or feel an emotion, it doesn't automatically make it true. So here's the flip side of it. Who's ever had an emotion about something and then you find out that that thing was not real? We create stories in our mind about maybe something that happened, and then we're worried about what someone else is thinking, and then we start to feel anxiety about it or grief about it. But then you actually ask them about it later on, or you find out that they were not even thinking about you. Half the time you're thinking about someone else and you're worrying and anxious about something, they're not even thinking about you. How freeing is that? You matter so little. Woo! Thank goodness for that. Yes.
So if emotions are neutral, why then do I feel such a release of energy or a relief when I express a sad emotion or I cry, and it feels energetically so relieving to me to do so? Mm-hmm. Or I laugh really hard and it's this abundance of a release of energy.
Absolutely.
And that's not neutral to me.
No. So the question was, how can they be neutral if we feel such a release when we cry or when we have a euphoric joy or anything like that? So how are they neutral if we have these amazing releases, right? And so what's interesting is I guess that kind of falls into what we're going to be going into, is that with emotions, with just human life in general, there's always this rising and receding of energy, rising and receding, rising and receding. And so emotions are constantly rising and receding within ourselves. But possibly what might add to the release is that we're releasing an attachment to it. So in a sense, if we were holding in a lot of grief for so long, we were having a lot of resistance, a lot of attachment, and all of a sudden you finally get to cry and let it out. Whew. So in that moment, there is this release of resistance, and that's the euphoria that one might be feeling.
The release of the attachment.
The release of the attachment that creates that flood, if you will. And so what's interesting, and I can relate to that quite a bit, but the more we get into the inner peace, which is kind of like a disclaimer, and it may actually make you not want to go into that direction, is that you have less of that polarity. You have less of that swing. Because now, and I think Andrew can attest as well, there are less highs, there's less lows, but there are also less highs. And sometimes that's what people, they say, they're like, but I like my highs and lows. I like the feeling of being way up here and the excitableness. But when you actually enter into a more at peaceness with things, the pendulum swing is a lot less severe. So yes, you don't have as many highs, but you also have far less lows. But again, excitement, those highs actually transform into something else. They transmute. They transmute into a quiet joy within the self. And there's just always this, whenever you have a bit more at peace with how life is, which the meditation practice I'm going to talk about really helps with, you actually notice that there is just an overarching joy that persists throughout the day. And the Buddha actually talks about that, and how if you do certain forms of meditation, you're going to notice that the more things you let go of, the less resistance you have. You actually start feeling a jovialness that follows you from one moment into the next moment, into the next moment, into the next moment. And so it's interesting that I've been teaching this for a while, but as I've been going deeper into these meditation practices, it's actually one of the outcomes when you fully do it. But again, a lot of people I've worked with over the years, they actually resist peace because they like the feeling of aliveness that comes from the and then the oh. And so it makes them feel alive. But what's interesting, because I talk about aliveness quite a bit, are we fully alive when we're going in those ups and downs? Because a lot of those ups and downs are coming from our non-present momentness, because we're holding on to something in the past, or maybe something even just recently that may have happened. We're holding on to that, so we're not actually able to be fully alive in the moment, or we're anticipating something in the future and we're not able to be fully alive in the moment. And so that's the irony, is that when we finally have that release, we feel that ecstasy in the moment. So we're touching the in the moment period, and it's heightened. But when you actually are feeling it every second or every minute of every day, that's where the jovialness, the joyfulness comes into being. So rather than getting it all at once, you're feeling it throughout the day. And I think in the Western mind, we have that issue, because who works really hard then looks forward to a vacation? So it's like you're saving up all your points of joy for just that 3-day weekend or that 2-week vacation period, versus experiencing the happiness on a daily basis, versus experiencing the presence on a daily basis. Because, there's another word, the presence, because a lot of times we're like, well, I can't really be fully present with my family because I'm working so hard. But once I'm on vacation, then I can relax. But ironically, then you really don't want to be present with your family, because you want to be present with yourself to get your peace. And so that's the irony, is that we're learning to, rather than having these big moments of release, we're learning to do them throughout the day. And again, that's where the practice comes into play. Excellent question. Thank you.
Dating versus marriage.
It is like dating versus marriage. Yeah. In the dating stages, it's the highs and lows. It's very dynamic. But then when you're married, hopefully it's not as dynamic. And then we have those little bursts every single day. You have that comfort. You have that check-in. And so absolutely, at least in my case, I could definitely attest that there's so much more stability now than there was prior. So let's take a breath. So, requoting Living Peace, just because I think a thought or feel an emotion, it doesn't automatically make it true. I love that. And I really want to bring that point home. I say it all the time. But so often we are thinking thoughts and we're feeling emotions and we create stories and we change our actions and our words with our relationships based upon these things, even when they're not based on fact. Even when they're not based on fact, they're more based on assumption and speculation on how we think someone feels about us or how we think they're going to respond to us. So we already develop a defense mechanism within ourselves when we go into conversations with people. So we already have our shield up when we're about to deliver some message to someone. Or maybe we're just alone and we're lost in our own grief and our mind, and we're having all these thoughts about other people. And in actuality, we may not know the full truth. Maybe we know something's off, but we don't know the full truth, but we're still filling in those gaps, and it makes us suffer so much more. And so very, very dangerous game that we play as humans when we're constantly developing stories about life, about other people. And what I've learned to do, because I was a very big user of that over the years, but what I've learned to do is that I will only respond to the information that's presented to me. And so rather than spend time speculating or worrying about what other people think, if they tell me everything's fine, I say, okay, everything's fine. And if I feel like they're lying to me, maybe I'll follow up with a question. But I'm only going to respond to the facts that I have, because chances are, yes, there's more information that I may not have. But if I'm filling in the gaps, I'm literally just creating illusions off of my own intuition. Who's ever used intuition as a source of figuring stuff out, but then you're like, actually not that accurate? You could feel something was off, but you didn't have the full story, and thus you filled in the story. But then once you got the full story, it was actually different than what you thought it was. And again, maybe there were times that you were accurate, and then you justify your intuition, and then you justify using it all the time and trying to psychically read everyone. But again, that is very inappropriate behavior, because you did not ask permission to read their energy field. You did not ask permission to go into them and try to psychoanalyze them. And as in this field of work, we learn definitely not to do that. And so anytime I bump into anyone, I could totally get into their psyche and figure things out. But that's not the thing to do without asking permission first. And so it's interesting that we're always trying to get into other people's business and figuring things out because we feel bothered by them in some way. And rather than actually asking direct questions, we are already creating stories about who they are as people, and how great of a disservice that is to humanity when we're creating stories versus actually creating relationships. Or rather creating deeper relationships and actually going there with each other. So let's breathe that in. And so starting this Wednesday, because it's the first Wednesday of August, I'm going to be bringing back an hour class every Wednesday night from 6 to 7. And that's going to be really joyful. It's going to be really, really wonderful in a sense that we're going to be actually really getting into more traditional forms of Buddhist meditation, such as samatha and Vipassana. I had it accurate earlier, but today. And again, what's interesting is that I've never specifically meditated on these, but as I've been learning more and more about them, I already have been doing them. And so it's interesting as I've never used the word, but as I'm diving deeper into it, I'm like, oh, this is what we've been doing in Living Peace for a long time now. And so it's really, 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 really cool. So with Vipassana meditation, I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, because I know some of you won't be able to come Wednesday night, so it'll at least be a great introduction. And especially for those of you who are at home, you can at least start practicing a little bit. So what I love about this is it's also called insight meditation, and it's all about seeing reality clearly for what it is. And depending on what Buddhist sect you come from, you're going to be probably practicing this or the samatha, or in my tradition that I come from, it's more of the zazen, and that's why I haven't really practiced these two as much. But there tends to be a crossover between the two. And so in Living Peace, previously before studying these forms of meditation, we often taught unconditional acknowledgement. Unconditional acknowledgement, really hear that word, unconditional acknowledgement. Acknowledging unconditionally whatever is happening in your present moment without adding any judgment to it. In a lot of ways, that is Vipassana meditation, where anytime you're in sitting meditation and you start to take note of what is happening around you, what is happening within you. And so in this deep insight awareness into yourself of what is happening within you, where your mind is going, what are the distractions around you, you start to take note of them, but you don't conceptualize them. And what that means is that you acknowledge their existence, but you're not adding a story to it. So if you notice that you're thinking about the past, you could possibly just continuously say, thinking, 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 or you can actually say past, 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 past. And then when your mind goes to the future, because it's going to change, it's not going to stay there. And then all of a sudden you start thinking about something in the future, you're going to say future, 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 or just again, thinking, thinking, thinking. And there's a few monks that I follow online, and this is exactly how they actually teach it. And they just say, just acknowledge what is happening within you without adding any story to it. Just repeatedly say the word, the word, the word. And then maybe if you're going to notice that you have some pain, you could say pain, pain, pain. Or maybe you start to feel sadness, 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 sadness. And you just continuously do this for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. Wherever your mind goes to, you just continuously, you just turn it into a short mantra, but then you shift the attention to something else once it shifts. You're not trying to control it. Now, samatha meditation, which we're going to eventually be teaching, that is more teaching the disciplined mind, where you actually just focus on one thing, and then you're training your mind to come back to the present moment. And that is normally what people think about when they think of meditation. They just think training the mind to come back to the source, training the mind to come back to the present moment, and then you use certain techniques to really train it. But I find that Vipassana meditation is actually a lot easier to do first, where you're just allowing your mind to go in any direction, allowing your body, the feelings to rise up, allowing the thoughts to come over here. But then you're learning to just look at them, but without conceptualizing them. And I promise you, this will take a lot of work to do, because every time you have a thought or an observation, your mind wants to create a story about it. Your mind wants to conceptualize it. And that's the danger that we have as our society, is that anytime we feel anything, we instantly add a label onto it. Well, that's not good. Well, this is great. Oh, that's bad for you. And so instantly we create stories. And so my invitation to all of you, whether or not you're coming to Wednesday nights, because at least we're going to get to practice together as a unit, I invite you to try this today at some time. Just sit down. Even if you want to lay down, that's fine. I'm not too worried about structure right now of posture, but really just observe. And maybe you have practiced Vipassana before, but try it in this way if you haven't tried it in this way, because again, different teachers are going to have different styles. And just observe without conceptualizing. And I was practicing this specifically a lot last night, because again, normally I practice Zazen or Samatha meditation. And it is interesting that the mind it's not going to like it. It's going to want to go in different directions, but then allow it to go in that direction. And then once it goes in that direction, you start, oh my gosh, I'm hungry. So then you just say, hunger, hunger, hunger. And this is such a profound experience, because it's teaching you, and it's really going to help you during your conscious states when you're just living your daily life. It's teaching you to stop fucking creating stories about everything, because that's where your suffering comes from. Suffering does not come from life itself. Pain comes from life itself. But the suffering that we're constantly experiencing together as a species is often exacerbated, whatever, how you pronounce that word, intensified dramatically by the thoughts and the ideas that we have about something. Who has an idea about who you think you are as a human being? Who has an identity, right? And it could even just be man, woman, right there. You just fucked everything up. Excuse my language. We go there here. But it's interesting is even just that right there, that polarity, that dichotomy has so much weight attached to it, and so much suffering and pain has been inflicted on both genders, and then even people now who don't want to belong to any specific gender throughout ages and centuries. And so even just that dichotomy right there, we create an identity around ourselves, and then we suffer. And so in this instance, we're learning to suspend our idea about being a man or a woman, or about being a political group, about being a certain religion. It doesn't matter what it is. You suspend that belief, that idea about yourself momentarily, and then you just sit and just say, thinking, 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 suffering, 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 pain, 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 sadness, sadness. But then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I actually feel okay. Happiness, happiness. You don't even want to make a big deal about the positive emotions that might arise as well. And then even the moment where it's like, if you want to stand or you're feeling discomfort, 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 it doesn't matter what it is. And you're going to notice that you're retraining the neural pathways in your mind, which is absolutely we do in our Zen training sessions all the time, so that you become very used to looking at things from an objective point of view. And that's partially why it's called insight meditation, is that for the first time in your life, I'm making a generalization, but for the first time in your life, you're able to look at things objectively without creating some attachment story around it of how it makes you feel, how moralizing or bad or wrong or good it is, and just sitting with it. And in my shoes and doing this kind of coaching, therapy, fun work, it's absolutely necessary that we hold space for other people, because when people sit down on that couch, they're going to tell you all their sources of suffering. They're going to tell you all the abuses that they've been through in their entire life. And guess what happens if you have a judgment? You can't help them. You can't help them from your own idea of who you think you are. It's more effective to suspend your whole ideology altogether and just fully listen. And in the full listening of their pain, you get to hear so much more roots of the answers that are to come, rather than already have a preconceived idea of how you think you're going to help them. There was a while where I always helped people from my own, even from Living Peace, I would just help them from how I think that they should follow the code, versus now, anytime someone comes with me with a new story or a new situation, I will mold the code to fit them. We still use the teachings, we still use the psychology principles, but we end up molding it to fit each individual on their own individual basis, rather than creating this cookie cutter mold that's supposed to fix everyone's lives. And that just doesn't work. Does that make sense? So that's why every time you look at who's had a judgment today against someone or something, right? Everyone. It's just a natural human thing. And the reason why you had that judgment is because you are looking at the world through your own lens. You are looking at reality through your reality, rather than looking at reality through over 7 billion different perceptions. Because there are as many perceptions as there are people alive. Some of you heard me say that before. But then you think yours is right. And oftentimes, who's ever had a friend that you gave advice to? You're giving advice to them through your own lens. And you're giving advice to them as if how you would respond in that situation if you were in their shoes. But that doesn't help them, because they're a completely different entity, and they're going to have to respond in the way that works for them. They're going to have to respond in the way that they understand reality and how the dynamics of their types of relationships, because it doesn't make sense for them to respond the way that you would respond, because they're a completely different being with a completely different reality, a different belief system, and a completely different relationship with these people that you don't even know about. There are so many variables. That's why when people are sitting on my couch, they're just like, oh, Lord, just give me your freaking opinion. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to give you my opinion. I'm going to give you observations based off of things that sometimes work for some people. And then let me know if this resonates, because when I say something, you're going to be able to feel it within yourself if you know that it is going to hit home for you or not. Does that make sense? And that's what keeps my ego on the sidelines rather than allowing it to run the show, because so often we look at life through our own lens. And that is precisely why there's so much conflict in the world right now, because everyone thinks that they're justified and right in their own perception. And a lot of really wonderfully meaning people that actually do have a lot of wonderful ideas that could help everyone, again, that's still not necessarily helping humanity, because we're not fully listening to other sides. This week I was thinking maybe I'll make a post about it at some point. I want everyone to start watching different news networks that you normally don't watch. And so if you normally watch Fox News, start watching something else at the same time. If you normally watch, what's another one? ABC, watch another one. So whatever it is, make sure if you're a little bit more conservative, start watching a little bit more liberal news channels. If you're liberal, start watching a little bit more conservative news channels. And then if you're a certain religion, start watching a talk on someone else who's a completely different religion than you. And so you want to create these constant little bridges of communication so you can actually understand where people are coming from. Because every single person, what we end up doing, and we sometimes do it subconsciously, we just get ourselves in these little bubbles of everyone who just agrees with us. And that is not helpful. When you're constantly surrounded by a bubble that everyone just reinforces the ideas that you already believe, that is actually a great disservice because it keeps you from actually understanding the pain that other people are going through. And it keeps you from understanding the root of different belief systems that if you are actually listening to other people of different walks of life, you'd be able to bridge that gap. And so again, maybe you'll be triggered. No matter what end of the spectrum you fall on, you might be triggered by other people with different opinions, but don't worry about that. You're getting triggered because you're caught up in your own identity of what you think is right, wrong, good, bad, all that fun duality stuff. But when you actually listen, it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And you can actually see the humanity, that, I mean, the thing that connects us all together as the underlying focus. And again, this actually goes well with the Vipassana meditation that we're doing, because you're able to just look, objectively observe things that are happening without adding a story to it. And this applies to news as well. We do that quite well now. Took us a while, but objectively look at all news and then just see the humanity there rather than getting caught up in the duality of right, wrong, good, bad, all this fun stuff. Now, again, we can look at peace, pain, because there's pain, there's harm, and then there's peace. You can still look at it from that angle, but we don't want to get into the whole conceptualized idea of, oh my gosh, that is so awful. I can't believe that this is happening. Those are such terrible people. Boom, you just lost your peace. You just fell into judgment rather than objectivity. And although you might use that as a motivating force, often you're going to start creating little fires along the way, because when you're worked up, what happens when you're often worked up? Does it lead to beautiful things? It can sometimes, but more often than not, it leads into a little bit more friction. It leads into brushing up against other people. It leads into you saying things that are out of alignment to people rather than actually being able to hold space for them. And anytime you speak out of alignment with people, rarely does it change their opinions, and more often than not, it actually creates more division and separation. And so that is a huge source of our power in Dunasha, in being able to objectively look at life and then respond from that place of focus, versus having an idea of what we think is right and then responding from that idea of what we think is right. And again, just look at your own damn life and you're going to see the times, even just in your romantic relationships, you're going to see the times where you've done that and it actually just led to further conflict. And you're just like, okay, let's just go to therapy. And then what does the counselor do? They hold space. They hold neutral space. But what's beautiful is that you can learn to do that in your very own family units. You can learn to do that in your own marriages. You can learn to do that with your own children. Hold neutral space. And then insight comes from that. Insight meditation comes from objectivity, just as insight communication comes from objectivity. So it is absolutely necessary that we constantly return to that neutral space. Neutral space, neutral space. Deep breath. And so actually I saw a post from someone lovely in the audience today, thank you by the way, where it was this really cool thing where it was based on seconds. I'm doing it based on minutes. And so there's 1,440 minutes every single day. And say someone pissed you off, you had a thing going on for 10 minutes. So that's 10 minutes versus 1,440 minutes. Now, do you allow, oh, here it was. So say you lost $10. Would you then, to find that $10, spend $1,440? And it's not a guarantee that you'd actually find the $10. So why the hell do all of you constantly try and lose your peace over those 10 minutes and trying to reclaim them and spending the rest of your day in suffering? Who's been bothered before? And then you wasted the whole freaking day conceptualizing it, analyzing it, going over it again and again and again, reliving the conversation again and again and again and again. And so maybe we're just going to do it for 6 hours. Maybe we just lose ourselves for 6 hours, not the whole day. That's still $360 for that $10 that you lost. And now you just gambled away $350 more dollars. It makes no sense when you put it a monetary value on it. And I think that the traditional thing was used in seconds. And if you use it in seconds, that's over $80,000 that you're wasting. And it was more like if $10 was stole from you, would you spend $80,000 in punishing that person? No. But what's interesting is that that's what we're doing every second of every day, that we're constantly reliving things and rehashing things that have no actual truth in this moment right here. Because in this moment right here, things are okay. But the mind goes over here, the mind goes over there. So just put that in perspective. I thought that was a really cool thing. Thank you, Sage. That was just a really cool awareness, and it puts perspective. So let's breathe that in. And so a couple more things I want to share before we wrap up is that in the insight meditation, there are 3 aspects that are really emphasized on it: impermanence, suffering, and non-self. So impermanence is that nothing lasts the same. Nothing stays the same. We know this, right? Everything is constantly changing. And then we have suffering, the nature of suffering, often coming from the 5 aggregates of Buddhism, the 5 attachments. Yes, they're scratching from our beloved angel in the background. And then, of course, we have non-self, which is the attachment to our own identity. We've already been talking about that. So the 3 questions for those of you who want to write this down, if you're taking notes. Anytime you get triggered, go ahead and ask yourself this: will this last forever? Will this situation, will this emotion last forever? You want to go get her? I know, I apologize for the heat. Yeah. And then the second question is, what am I attached to?
What was it again?
First one is, will this last forever? And the second one is, what am I attached to? You know, what part of this story am I attached to? For many of you, it will be, I was wronged. Oftentimes it is the disrespect. You know, that is a very common thing that we feel disrespected by, but then the opposite side of it is that we might be over sympathizing with things, where we really get into the grief of things. And the third one is, how does my identity reinforce this attachment? How does my identity reinforce this attachment? As a gay man, I was freaking bothered by a lot of things, anything that had to do with anything regarding gay rights. And I would get 2 days ago on Facebook, our picture when we first got our rings popped up, and it was just so cute. And I'm like, holy shit, 2 years prior to that, I would not even be allowed to get married. And so it's interesting that that wasn't even a legal option. And so prior, I would always be really worked up around this gay rights thing because it affected my life in a very negative or positive way. And so what did I have to do? I hated being upset all the time, you know, and feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't get married, can't do this, all these things. And I'm constantly, you know, I can't, even to this day, Andrew and I just can't walk out here and hold hands. You know, I don't want to draw further attention. Many were fully open, but in a small conservative town in America, it's not the smartest thing to do, you know, holding hands with another man walking down the street. And again, people, and this is where some of the, I'm going to call it heterosexual privilege, comes into being, where you don't even think of those things. You don't even think that that is something that a lot of individuals suffer with on a daily basis, that they can't even show small acts of kindness and affection to their beloved. And that's something Andrew and I have to deal with on a daily basis. And again, we could be pissed off about it. But again, I release my attachment. I release my identity to being a gay man because I recognize that doesn't help me. Me being upset about that does not help me. And it does not help the movement. It does not help anyone else. So I suspend my conceptualized identity of being a gay man and I just let it go. And so what am I attached to? So that is How does my identity reinforce this attachment? What am I attached to? Well, I want to freaking be able to hold my hand down the street without being called a faggot. You know, that would be really, really nice. And then will this last forever? No. Every year it gets a little bit better. And will maybe this emotion within me last forever? No, I'm going to get distracted by something else. I'm going to live my life, and there's so many more beautiful things going on that I don't need to focus on this one thing that happened to me previously that I'm just going to keep reliving in my head and in my head. By the way, that has happened to me before. And so it's interesting that we can use that 10-minute or 10-second situation and just lose our peace over it. So that's a pretty good example. That's a pretty good example. That's a really real life example that we have to actually deal with on a daily basis. But again, I don't resist it. I just accept that that is the nature of things right here, right now. So rather than fighting that one thing, what can I focus on? Well, we're doing it right now. We're really focusing on our inner peace and understanding that everything is impermanent, that this over-attachment we have to identity can actually cause more suffering than healing. And then also, the very nature of suffering comes from our specific attachments that we have on what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. And so even the people who call me a faggot, I can easily sit down with them and not be offended by them. And they can even say, I think you're an abomination, you deserve to go to hell. And literally them saying that will not trigger anything in my body. And I will just say, well, tell me more about that. Let's talk about this. I'm really fascinated. I'm really curious to know, your beliefs about this. And when I listen to them fully, this has happened before too, what's beautiful is it builds a bridge. And because they feel respected and heard, it actually opens a door for me to then share a little bit about myself. But what's interesting is when I share about myself, I don't say that they're wrong. I just say this has been my experience, and this is why I focus on inner peace. And so it creates a beautiful dialogue. And so again, that's just a really cool example, a very personal example that happens. And I hope you can kind of see how that might fit into your own life, even though you don't have that necessary. You may not necessarily have that struggle. So let's go ahead and take a breath. Breathing in, letting go. And I'm just going to end with something so frivolous, but there's smartness. There's smartness in it. There's intelligence in it. And some of you heard me say this before, but the young monk asked the wise old master, he said, "Master, how do you have inner peace all the time?" And the master said, "Well, it's because I don't mind what happens. I don't mind what happens." And again, people might look at that as saying, well, that's not helpful. You want to mind what happens in the world so you can promote change. But what's fascinating is that we want to make sure that we're promoting change from a place of mindfulness and inner peace rather than aggression and frustration. And yes, aggression and frustration often gets things done a lot quicker, but a lot of times once you make that big flip, that big switch, then there's all this other karmic healing that needs to take place of the people that you overpowered. And so now they feel unheard. But when you actually start to heal lives through mindfulness, patience, and compassion and deep listening, you can actually build bridges and completely remove the karmic loop that we fall into versus shutting people up through aggression. And every single one of you have most likely done this in one relationship or another where you've shut someone down without fully listening to them. And then, yes, they're no longer barking at you, right? It goes silent. And the momentary issue is over. But now there's another issue that needs healing, and that's the resentment that starts to breed underneath of I don't feel heard in this relationship. Just as many people in our country don't feel heard of all political spectrums, of all religious institutions, that's the part that we're looking to heal with mindfulness. And that's why it's important to take our time and go slow rather than take our time and go super fast. And then it just ends up creating more mess that often needs to be healed later on. And that's the karmic. You can see this happening on a micro level in your very lives when you just shut people down. And that doesn't heal shit. And then we can see that happening on a macro level as well. And so all of y'all's homework is to this week watch a few different news networks that you normally don't watch and just listen objectively and see what's going on rather than just instantly getting triggered and saying, you believe you know what's right and yada, yada, yada. And all of that, yes, your stance may not change, and that's not my goal. My goal is not to change anyone's stances on anything. My goal is just to foster a deeper understanding of other individuals' lives, because every single person's life is important and matters. And that is the goal of this exercise. And then, of course, you can practice your Vipassana meditation, your insight meditation, and you're just observing what is going on and just stating it factually without conceptualizing it. Deep breath. Good luck.
What if you don't watch the news?
I was just gonna say, I don't watch the news.
Then possibly you can read various articles. You know, if you're an article reader, that would work as well. Yeah, because again, many of us if you're on social media, things pop up. And sometimes you're going to click the ones that you agree with. And so possibly click with ones that you normally don't agree with, or you may not normally see. Maybe you've hidden it from your timeline. You don't see many things. So there's a lot of different ways that you can practice this. But if you don't normally watch the news, then it might be an opportunity to tap in. You can even just find news segments on YouTube and just find it fascinating. Now, I'm not saying go full in, but it's just an interesting exercise to see if there's any triggering that arises, and can I practice objectivity in this moment? So you could adjust it as you see fit.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Kind of. I feel like I'm surrounded by people that don't think like me already.
Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case, then practice the objectivity in that, and maybe start a dialogue and just ask them. Rather than just being told it all the time, actually sit down and invite the discussion. But again, our job is just to objectively listen in that moment. Very good. So let's take a breath. Thank you all for joining in. I hope my new little audio, oh, look at this. I got a new microphone. I hope it works a little bit better than last week, because I know last week's audio was a little bit wonky. So thank you all so much. Links are down below for those of you who want to donate. If you are someone who tunes in weekly, I do invite you donating a little bit just as a helpful energy exchange. It really does make a difference for us. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week.